How many of you have read To Kill a Mockingbird? Can I have a show of hands? Okay, almost universal there. Okay, how many of you were required to read it at some point in your education? Well over half, yeah. Okay. Reliable surveys tell us that the novel is required reading in 3/4 of America's public schools. It was required reading for me in 10th grade English class, along with Huckleberry Finn. According to Stephen Metcalf of Slate magazine, To Kill a Mockingbird has, quote, has become an inescapable fact of America's civic religion, end of quotes. The novel, written by Alabama native Harper Lee, was published in 1960 and was an immediate success, winning the Pulitzer Prize in 1961, spawned an Oscar-winning film in 1962. And even today, it is consistently ranked as the second most influential book in America, after, of course, the Bible. To briefly refresh your memory, the novel tells the story of Atticus Finch, a small-town lawyer in the Deep South during the Depression, who is appointed by the court to defend Tom Robinson, a black man accused of raping a young white woman. The story is told to us through the eyes of Scout Finch, Atticus's 6-year-old daughter. Atticus doesn't want his young daughter to witness the trial, but she slips into the crowded courtroom and watches the trial from the colored section in the balcony. Atticus convincingly establishes that the young white woman and her father, the town drunk, are lying when they accuse Robinson of rape, when in actuality it was she who has made sexual advances toward Robinson. In spite of convincing evidence of Robinson's innocence, the all-white jury convicts him, and Atticus vows to appeal this decision, but Robinson, afraid that he will never get justice, tries to escape and is shot and killed. And that's the bare bones account of what the main plot is of the novel. It culminates in the tension-filled courtroom as Atticus brings the truth to light, a truth that fails to overcome the prejudices and the fears of the jury and the townspeople. This is one way to understand the story. A novel about a liberal white lawyer fighting for justice for an innocent black man, which leads to a suspenseful courtroom drama and finally ends in defeat and an ultimate tragedy. If this was the only way to read the story, it would have made a very good book, as John Grisham capitalized on, and probably would have enjoyed some limited success. But to achieve the iconic status that this book has enjoyed over the 50 or so years, there has to be more to this story than just a story of racial injustice and an uphill courtroom battle. As in all great novels, there are numerous subplots which all function to either endear the characters to us or bring about our loathing. The childhood escapades of Scout and the other children might seem to just function to move the story along and keep you entertained. But if you carefully analyze them, these subplots, especially the story of the children's fascination with their neighbor, Boo Radley, these stories expose the roots of our irrational fears of those who are different from us. And they show some of the subtle ways that we acquire our prejudices. But at one and the same time, the book is a delightful children's tale. And it's a poignant story about the loss of innocence. Scout and her brother Jim see and experience why the racism beneath the fine, upstanding Christian veneer of the town's citizens is so evil. Tom Robinson's death is the immediate result of that evil. And so the title of this book continues to haunt our cultural consciousness. To Kill a Mockingbird. Does that refer to the death of Tom Robinson? Or to the death of childhood innocence? Or both? Or to something else altogether? I submit that the symbolism of that title works on many, many levels. This story totally captivated me and inspired me when I first read it. For me, a white kid who grew up in an overtly racist family and town in the Deep South, reading the book was important because it made me deeply uncomfortable with the way things were. And it gave me at least the beginnings of a way to name those things that I was uncomfortable with. For me, Atticus Finch made a terrific role model for such virtues as honesty, integrity, courage. Sometimes I even wonder if I would have become a liberal if I had not been exposed to the morally authoritative presence that Atticus Finch presented to the world through the novel and then the movie. And that's fine for me. Here was a paradigm of virtue for me to emulate. But simultaneously with that high school reading, I also experienced something else. Something I have a bit of trouble naming. It was 1971 when my high school class read that book. And racial integration had been in effect for a mere 5 years. As a part of studying the book together, the black members of my class were called on to read aloud certain excerpts of the book. All of us were required to do this. The teacher wasn't singling them out. But hearing parts of the story in this way, experiencing it in this way, especially the use of the N word, was, well, painful. I guess in some rudimentary way, I was beginning to ask myself, what is it like to read this story What was it like for the black members of my class? What were they feeling? What was I feeling? Was it embarrassment for the African American students? Was it shame? I'm still not sure I can name it, but it was powerful. I ask you this morning, what could my young, impressionable black classmates possibly have found in this story that could be edifying in any way? The black characters are completely one-dimensional. They come across only as victim, never exhibit any agency in the cause of their own struggle for justice. The only black character in the story that exhibits any gumption at all is Calpurnia, a servant in the Finch household. But even her character has been lambasted by critics of the novel, because even though her actions are a bit amusing and her dialogue is very witty, she is really an updated version of the contented slave. Anyway, having had these thoughts and experiences during my first reading of this book, through the years, I've taken a special interest in all the criticisms that have been leveled against the book. And in hindsight, it's especially interesting to study how these criticisms of the book have changed in the past 55 years. And I think these criticisms give us a glimpse. I think they're telling about the state of the struggle for civil rights in this country. Back in the 60s and 70s, most critics were up in arms in the schools about using a story that makes explicit use of a physical relationship between a white female and a black male. In 1966, perhaps the most notorious of these cases was that of a parent in the Hanover school system in Richmond, Virginia, that went to the school board claiming that this plot device, this relationship, was, quote, immoral. Sadly, most of the complaints in this era were not about the depictions of a sexual assault, but they were about the descriptions of Mayella Ewell's attraction to Tom Robinson. That's what seemed to most upset the sensibilities of our genteel Southern culture. In this era, the 60s and 70s, the criticisms came from a certain segment of indignant whites. Now, fast forward to the 90s and past 2000. By this time, attitudes toward race had shifted rather dramatically in our country. And now, To Kill a Mockingbird faced challenges from a very different quarter. One high-profile criticism came from the Black Educators Association in Canada, who petitioned to have the book removed from school curriculums and from school use. In their recommendation to the school board, their report stated, quote, "The terminology in this novel subjects students to humiliating experiences that rob them of their self-respect and the respect of their peers. The N word is used 48 times in the novel. We believe that the English language arts curriculum in Nova Scotia must enable all students to feel comfortable with ideas, feelings, and experiences presented without fear of humiliation. To Kill a Mockingbird is clearly a book that no longer meets these goals and therefore must no longer be used for classroom instruction. End of quotes. And that is the argument in one form or another that continues to be the crux of the complaints that are leveled against the book today. Though To Kill a Mockingbird is obviously anti-racist in spirit, reading the book is still a vastly different experience for whites than it is for blacks. It's pretty much expected that everyone will feel indignation at the injustices of what Tom Robinson went through, and disgust at the racism that smolders beneath the genteel Southern manners. But having no protagonist in the story with which they can identify is clearly problematic for African American readers. And that's why a popular teaching guide for the novel cautions, quote, "What seems wonderful or powerful to one group of students may seem degrading to another." End of quotes. Another serious criticism of the book, and the one that I want us to focus on this morning, concerns the character of Atticus Finch. The widespread popularity of this novel made Atticus Finch somewhat of a folk hero, almost like he's a real person. In legal circles, he is revered to this day. An article in the Michigan Law Review about Atticus Finch stated, quote, "No real-life lawyer has done more for the self-image or public perception of the legal profession." End of quotes. They need all the help they can get. Present company excluded. In 2003, the American Film Institute voted Atticus Finch, as portrayed by Gregory Peck, the greatest hero in American film history. Wow. It would seem that this fictional character is completely unassailable. But has that kept our historical and cultural revisionists from making the effort? No. Their critique concerns Atticus's Southern gentlemanly manners and his, quote, "never be anything but gracious," quote, end of quote, approach to his neighbors. In explaining the racism of the townspeople to Scout, Atticus says they are suffering from a, quote, "sickness that renders them unable to see a black man as a real person." He is unfailingly forgiving. And so, to his critics, that makes him a Jim Crow liberal. Someone who will defend a black man in a court of law if he is appointed to do so, but inwardly thinks that if all of us would just hold hands and sing Kumbaya, the problem of racism would simply go away. To his critics, Atticus is an accommodationist, not a reformer. And for that reason, he should not be held up as a heroic figure. Stay with me. Stay with me. No longer to see him as a hero? Really? Someone who sits up all night in front of the Macomb jail to protect Tom Robinson single-handedly from a lynch mob? I wonder. It would seem that Atticus's decision to risk his own life and to expose his children to attack isn't enough for some critics of the novel. Stay with me. Though it was a difficult step for me, I have come to see there is merit in this analysis of Atticus Finch's character. And not just as we read the novel from our virtuous perspective of 2015 and the accumulated hindsight that these 55 years of hard-won reforms, as well as the changes that have come about by the sheer momentum of history. I've come to see that many of the modern critiques of To Kill a Mockingbird are justified, especially its use in the classroom by teachers not properly trained in facilitating a multicultural and multi-ethnic conversation for the reasons that I've tried to outline. In 2015, racism is still very much with us. But it has a different look to it. And it manifests itself in different ways. The anti-racism of To Kill a Mockingbird, the anti-racism it advocates for, is the anti-racism of a different and in many ways a bygone era. Having said all that, and acknowledge the validity of this argument that even a book that is as anti-racist as To Kill a Mockingbird can still contain racist elements and still needs to be treated carefully. And a few more questions need to be raised. I hope we never reach the point where the criticisms of the novel undo the good that the novel obviously did and continues to do in furthering the cause for civil rights. But have we really reached the point in our human evolutionary consciousness that not only can we attack the morals of a bygone era, but we can also attack all artistic and historical treatment of that era? It seems like when that's done in this case, we are also diminishing a heroic figure. And can we really afford to do that? In an era where heroes and heroines are all too few. It might be time for us to ask ourselves in these revisionist-prone times, are we really improving our present morality when we find new yardsticks to measure the old? Or are we really just projecting our white guilt onto the past so that we don't have to do the real work that we should be doing to deal with racism today? Is it prudent to diminish inspirational figures from the past who acted courageously within the context of the time in which they lived and advance the causes of justice, equity, and compassion just because their stance is not politically correct by modern standards? A lot of questions there. They're all very interesting questions, and I don't profess to have the answers to those questions. I'm a pilgrim too. But I do think that there are questions that a faith tradition such as ours, that affirms and promotes a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, needs to be asking itself. Those who defend Atticus Finch on these grounds, and by extension the book and Harper Lee, make a good point. Taken as a whole, it would be very difficult to say that Harper Lee was not singularly courageous in writing To Kill a Mockingbird and in creating such a figure as Atticus Finch. The lessons she taught through the book, to stand up for what's right, even when the costs are high, that's still as relevant as ever. The words she puts in Atticus's mouth as he's counseling Scout, quote, "You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it." End of quotes. That might be a better way to express the golden rule than even the way Jesus did. Taken as a whole, I can't think of too many novels that affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. That accomplishment alone, to write a novel that promotes that in the American South before civil rights, a culture completely inexplicable to anyone who wasn't born and raised here, that alone would seem to be quite a literary accomplishment. On the other hand, let's face it, To Kill a Mockingbird is a story written by a white author about a white protagonist who basically only deals with a white perspective. As literature, as a period piece, it's very, very good at telling one side of the story. But it's a liberal fairy tale. But that's okay. We need fairy tales. Heroic figures can serve the human psyche well and give us great stories to tell our children, as long as our adult side realizes it's a fairy tale. Perhaps to highlight the other side of the story and lend a little realism to our romantic idealism, the book should be read alongside Mildred Taylor's Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. That book, written by a black author, has as its central theme racism in the Deep South, and has many parallel elements to Kill a Mockingbird. Like Lee's book, Roll of Thunder has a child as its central character and storyteller, a 9-year-old black girl growing up in Mississippi during the Depression. Are you seeing a pattern? The story even has an anti-racist white lawyer who makes a noble attempt to stop a lynching. Here, the white champion of the African American plight tries to act just as heroically as the oh-so-noble Atticus Finch. But the lynch mob's response to the story is a bit more realistic. And don't worry, the horrific end is averted. After all, it's also a children's story, just a more believable one. Contrasting the two books, Roll of Thunder is in some ways a more sophisticated work because, unlike To Kill a Mockingbird, it expounds on the simple perspective of the child protagonist and tries to give us a glimpse of what is really going on around her. At any rate, I found it a very good counterpoint to the liberal white fairy tale elements of To Kill a Mockingbird, and I do think it makes a great companion read. So in conclusion, whether you think To Kill a Mockingbird is a great work or not, I hope you can at least agree that the title of the work, which says literally nothing about the literal plot of the story, but it's a wonderful metaphor for the destruction of innocence. As a metaphor, it speaks a poetic truth, a truth that transcends any moral or literary imperfections in the book. I began by asking you if the metaphor referred to Tom Robinson, or the death of childhood innocence, or to both, or to something else altogether. And so for your homework assignment today, I want you to ponder this. Could the mockingbird refer to the innocence that none of us can claim when it comes to racism in this country? When I first heard criticisms of Atticus Finch, I rushed to defend him. Isn't it amazing, this human capacity that we have to always think we have the moral high ground? Well, with time and the patience under the tutelage of some of my anti-racist friends who are very adept at this work, I've come to realize that some of those criticisms of Atticus Finch are justified. And I've come to see some chinks in the armor of my great white knight. And in the process, the innocence of my impressionable teen adoration has been destroyed. The mockingbird was killed. In retrospect, it's easy for me to see that it had to die. And with time, that death has become a little more palatable, especially once I began to recognize the flip side of the death of innocence, which is a coming of age. Relinquishing a bit of my hero worship of Atticus allowed me to grow into a more complex understanding of the many-headed hydra of racism, a process I haven't finished. Actually, I've only just begun. And I'm 60 years old. And I've been a minister for 10 of those years. It's a process in which I've occasionally acted nobly and often acted rather poorly. But I continue to work at it, and it's making me into a better person and a better ally to people of color. So may we continue the work of anti-racism that will one day bend the moral arc of the universe toward justice and make this a world that can honor the inherent worth and dignity of all. May it be so.